In my last video, I discussed how the Harry Potter film franchise effectively butchered Voldemort's character by omitting huge portions of his backstory. I then went on to argue that without these character tidbits, well, tidbits if they were massive, what's the massive version of a tidbit? It's nearly impossible to properly understand Voldemort's motivations as a villain. Why is he obsessed with immortality? Who were his parents? Why does he feel like he's got so much to prove? In the films, Voldemort is essentially reduced to he's evil because he's evil. A scary dark wizard do bad thing. And while this was certainly less than ideal, we do still get the gist of his, albeit much flatter, character. But for a character like Dumbledore, who has far more moral ambiguity, especially in his earlier years, the omission of these foundational pieces of his story becomes even more problematic. And like Voldemort, Dumbledore's origins are barely touched on in the films. From the films and the films alone, we sort of get that he's got some brother drama, some father drama, some mother drama, and even some sister drama, if potentially killing her counts as that. But we never see how these events shaped him into the wise old headmaster of present day. We never see the guilt, the fear of power, the self-imposed restraint that defines who Dumbledore becomes. And most importantly, his relationship with Grindelwald, the single most consequential relationship of his life, is almost entirely omitted. Today we'll be diving into territory that the films didn't cover and taking a closer look at the Albus Dumbledore film fans never got the chance to see. Hey everyone, welcome to another installment of Harry Potter Theory. To begin to understand Dumbledore's character, we need to wind back the clock, way back to the late 1800s. Born Albus Percival Wulfric Brian Dumbledore in the year 1881, Albus grew up in a town called Mold on the Wold, a mainly wizarding town in the UK. It was here that Albus lived with his family, his father Percival, his mother Kendra, his sister Ariana, and his brother Aberforth. At this stage, though the family possessed some powerful wizards, the Dumbledores were not particularly famous or noteworthy. It wasn't until nearly a decade after Albus's birth that the Dumbledore family was suddenly thrust into the spotlight. You see, in 1891, when Albus's sister Ariana was just 6 years old, she was brutally assaulted by 3 Muggle boys after they saw her performing magic. The attack traumatized Ariana so deeply that she lost the ability to control her magical abilities, forcing her power inward in dangerous, unpredictable ways. Although Percival, Albus's father, was typically a mild-mannered man, when he learned what had been done to his daughter, he responded in a blind rage, tracking down the boys and violently attacking them. For this crime, he was sentenced to Azkaban. Perhaps the saddest part of this whole story, however, is that Percival never explained why he had attacked them. He feared that if the Ministry discovered the true nature of Ariana's condition, she would be institutionalized at St. Mungo's as a threat to the Statute of Secrecy. And with no explanation offered, the wizarding world assumed Percival's actions were motivated by radicalized blood purist hatred toward Muggles, an assumption that couldn't have been further from the truth. From that moment on, the Dumbledore name was quietly tarnished, at least for a time. Rita Skeeter discusses this in her book, The Life and Lies of Albus Dumbledore. Proud and haughty, Kendra Dumbledore could not bear to remain in Mold on the Wold after her husband Percival's well-publicized arrest and imprisonment in Azkaban. She therefore decided to uproot the family and to relocate to Godric's Hollow, the village that was later to gain fame as the scene of Harry Potter's strange escape from you-know-who. Like Mold on the Wold, Godric's Hollow was home to a number of wizarding families, but as Kendra knew none of them, she would be spared the curiosity about her husband's crime she had faced in her former village. Just 1 year later, in the autumn of 1892, Albus, now 11 years old, began his education at Hogwarts. When he first started attending the school, he had a bit of a hard time, as there was still a lot of stigma surrounding his father. Because of his father's actions, people were under the impression that the Dumbledore family hated Muggles, Albus included, and this made his formative year at Hogwarts difficult. For his part, Albus had arrived at Hogwarts under the burden of unwanted notoriety. Scarcely a year previously, his father, Percival, had been convicted of a savage and well-publicized attack upon 3 young Muggles. However, after just 1 year at Hogwarts, Albus seemed to be able to slowly overcome the negative preconceptions people had of him by excelling in school and showcasing his generally positive demeanor. It also certainly didn't hurt that he showcased prodigious magical ability that allowed him to stand out from his peers. In a matter of months, however, Albus's own fame had begun to eclipse that of his father. By the end of his first year, he would never again be known as the son of a Muggle hater, but as nothing more or less than the most brilliant student ever seen at the school. For the remainder of Dumbledore's studies, with his negative associations now a thing of the past, Dumbledore continued to excel, achieving every award and accolade imaginable. In his 7th year at Hogwarts, Albus took his newts for both charms and transfiguration. Newts are a test that 7th year witches and wizards take to prepare themselves for careers after graduation. A wizard can only take the newt exams after completing all of their owls, and receiving a score of exceeds expectations. And how you score on your newts will generally dictate what sort of career path you follow in the wizarding world. Albus did so well on his newts that Griselda Marchbanks, a professor working for the Wizarding Examinations Authority, once remarked that Albus was able to do things with a wand that she had never seen before. He then went on to win the Barnabas Finkley Prize for exceptional spellcasting and a gold medal for groundbreaking contributions to the International Alchemical Conference. Albus was a shining star in the halls of Hogwarts, and his fame, though not yet widespread, began to grow. Rita Skeeter had something to say about this as well. Now approaching his 18th birthday, Dumbledore left Hogwarts in a blaze of glory. Head boy, prefect, winner of the Barnabas Finkley Prize for exceptional spellcasting, British youth representative to the Wizengamot, groundbreaking contribution to the International Alchemical Conference in Cairo, Dumbledore intended next to take a grand tour with Alpheus Dogbreath Doge, the dim-witted but devoted sidekick he'd picked up at school. Those plans, however, were quickly shattered when he received news that his mother, Kendra, had been killed in a tragic accident caused by Ariana's uncontrollable magic. You see, after Ariana was attacked as a child, she was left so traumatized that she suppressed her magical abilities entirely. That suppression left her magic dangerously unstable, and after one tragic emotional outburst, she accidentally killed her own mother. With his father imprisoned, responsibility fell to Albus. Instead of setting out into the world, he was forced to return home and care for a younger sister whose condition terrified him, a responsibility he would later admit he deeply resented. And it was here in Godric's Hollow, just as his life was meant to begin, that everything would finally collapse. After returning to Godric's Hollow, it didn't take long for Albus to cross paths with Gellert Grindelwald, a brilliant young wizard who had recently arrived in the village to live with his great-aunt, Bathilda Bagshot, a respected magical historian and longtime friend of the Dumbledore family. From their very first meeting, the two recognized something rare in one another. Both were exceptionally gifted, intellectually curious, and painfully aware of the limits imposed on the wizarding world. For the first time in his life, Albus had met someone who could truly match him, and that realization was intoxicating. But their connection was not purely intellectual. As the weeks passed, admiration deepened into genuine affection, and Dumbledore would later admit that his feelings for Grindelwald blinded him to the dangers he might otherwise have seen. Grindelwald, who had already been expelled from Durmstrang for dangerous experimentation, was openly dismissive of wizarding law and restraint. He spoke passionately about power, destiny, and the absurdity of wizards hiding their abilities from muggles. And rather than recoiling from these ideas, Dumbledore listened. As their bond deepened, Grindelwald shared his vision for dismantling the International Statute of Secrecy and establishing a new world order, one in which wizards ruled openly, and what began as theoretical debate soon evolved into genuine conviction. And the most shocking part, Dumbledore didn't merely entertain the idea, he embraced it. Together, the two refined the philosophy, convincing themselves that wizarding dominance would not be tyranny, but responsibility. And it was during the summer that they gave their belief a name, for the greater good. In that very same summer, Dumbledore actually wrote Grindelwald a letter discussing their plans. And perhaps the most interesting part is that Dumbledore speaks in a tone so unlike what we're accustomed to. The same letter was published in Rita Skeeter's The Life and Lies of Albus Dumbledore. Gellert, your point about wizard dominance being for the muggles' own good. This, I think, is the crucial point. Yes, we have been given power, and yes, that power gives us the right to rule, but it also gives us responsibilities over the ruled. We must stress this point. It will be the foundation stone upon which we build. Where we are opposed, as we surely will be, this must be the basis of all our counter-arguments. We seize control for the greater good, and from this it follows that where we meet resistance, we must use only the force that is necessary and no more. This was your mistake at Durmstrang, but I do not complain, because if you had not been expelled, we would never have met. Albus. But these grand plans didn't stick around for long, at least in the mind of Albus, because this entire ideological shift, the plans, the letters, the belief in ruling for the greater good, unfolded inside the Dumbledore family home, at a time when Albus was still responsible for his younger siblings. And in the middle of it all was Ariana, who was tragically killed in the chaos that followed. The tragedy of Dumbledore's sister, Ariana, is one that haunted him for the rest of his life. Present at the time of Ariana's death was Albus, his younger brother Aberforth, and Gellert Grindelwald. Here's how it unfolded in Aberforth's words. I pulled out my wand, and he pulled out his, and I had the Cruciatus curse used on me by my brother's best friend, and Albus was trying to stop him, and then all three of us were dueling, and the flashing light and the bangs set her off. She couldn't stand it. The colour was draining from Aberforth's face, as though he had suffered a mortal wound, and I think she wanted to help, but she didn't really know what she was doing, and I don't know which of us did it. It could have been any of us, and she was dead. It's very unclear who was directly responsible for Ariana's death, and even decades later, while visiting Harry in death, Dumbledore admits that he never fully knew who killed her. It was the truth I feared. You see, I never knew which of us, in that last horrific fight, had actually cast the curse that killed my sister. I dreaded beyond all things the knowledge that it had been I who brought about her death. Dumbledore was many things, brilliant, powerful, a visionary, but he was also extremely ambitious, and for a brief moment in his life, that ambition consumed him. Alongside Grindelwald, he dreamt of reshaping the world, and it's easy to forget just how deep into that ideology Albus had fallen. Which brings me to a theory of mine. In the context of building a new world order, Ariana was a problem. She was a fragile, unstable girl with unpredictable magic that had already killed once. She couldn't be taken along in this new world order, nor could she be left alone. She was an obstacle to his plans, to his freedom, and maybe even to his relationship with Grindelwald. Therefore, I'd like to put forward the idea that in the chaos of the duel, Dumbledore saw his chance, and in that split second he made a terrible, heart-wrenching choice, but a choice nonetheless. A way to silence the one thing tying him to a life he no longer wanted. If that's the case, if he made the conscious decision to eliminate her, it would explain why he could never bring himself to seek the truth. Because while Grindelwald fled and Aberforth grieved, Dumbledore spent the rest of his life atoning. He turned away from power, he refused the role of Minister for Magic, he fought for peace, mentored Harry, and ultimately sacrificed himself to make things right. All of it, every act of goodness, could have been his way of burying the darkest truth of all, that in his pursuit of the greater good, he destroyed the one person he should have protected most. And it's that unresolved past that directly informs many of the decisions we see Dumbledore make in the films. The Gaunt Ring fiasco is a perfect example of this. In the books, Dumbledore finds the ring in the ancestral home of the Gaunt family just outside of Little Hangleton, a moment that's completely absent from the films, I might add. The ring belonged to Marvolo Gaunt, a pureblood wizard and descendant of Salazar Slytherin. And after examining the ring, he immediately knew that he had found the Deathly Hallow he always craved most, the Resurrection Stone. Notably, Dumbledore knew the ring was cursed, as he was aware that it had been turned into a Horcrux by Voldemort. But he still puts it on, later claiming that in his excitement of recovering the stone, he forgot just how dangerous it was. After another short pause, Harry said, "You tried to use the Resurrection Stone." Dumbledore nodded. "When I discovered it, after all those years, buried in the abandoned home of the Gaunts, the Hallow I'd craved most of all, though in my youth I'd wanted it for very different reasons, I lost my head, Harry. I quite forgot that it was now a Horcrux, that the ring was sure to carry a curse. I picked it up and I put it on, and for a second I imagined that I was about to see Ariana and my mother and my father, and to tell them how very, very sorry I was. If you only know the film Dumbledore, then it's pretty hard to believe that he could have ever made this kind of mistake. Film Dumbledore is, for the most part, wise, all-knowing, composed, and seemingly incapable of error. He's the man with the plan, the chess master who always appears 10 steps ahead. And if you've only watched the films, this decision barely makes sense, because the films strip away the very backstory that explains why Dumbledore would ever be tempted to put the ring on. For a man who'd spent his entire life haunted by his sister's death, finding a relic like the Resurrection Stone was a big deal. And interestingly, this particular mistake mirrors the one that defined his youth, allowing emotion and ambition to override caution. The same pattern also explains many of Dumbledore's other choices. He repeatedly refuses the position of Minister for Magic, not because he lacks confidence, but because he no longer trusts himself with power. He openly admits this to Harry. Years passed. There were rumors about Grindelwald. They said he had procured a wand of immense power. I, meanwhile, was offered the post of Minister for Magic, not once, but several times. Naturally, I refused. I'd learned that I was not to be trusted with power. Even his fixation on the greater good evolves. What once justified domination and control becomes, later in life, a philosophy of sacrifice and restraint. Dumbledore still believes outcomes matter, but now he believes the cost must fall on him, not on others. And none of this context is meaningfully explored in the films. The years following the death of Albus's sister are a little unclear, particularly between the years 1900 and 1910, as we have very little concrete information that provides us with dates or details. However, we do know that after the death of his sister and his departure from both Grindelwald and his brother Aberforth, Dumbledore was free to go about his business as he pleased. With exact dates aside, we do know that he did a few things. One of the first major events in Dumbledore's life after departing Godric's Hollow was his trip to France, where he visited his old friend Nicolas Flamel. Flamel was a famed alchemist, and it was in France that Dumbledore studied the ancient art and science of alchemy under his tutelage. After an unknown period of time, Dumbledore returned back to Britain, and it just so happened that in this time period, Dumbledore became infatuated with the study of dragon's blood, specifically its uses. Dumbledore's eventual discovery and publication of the 12 uses of dragon's blood led to his first taste of real, undeniable fame, earning him widespread recognition and the offer of a teaching position at Hogwarts. Between 1910 and 1926, Dumbledore worked away at Hogwarts vigilantly, happy to give back and serve as a pinnacle of knowledge to the younger generations of the wizarding population. And by the time the Fantastic Beasts films begin in 1926, Dumbledore is already an established figure within the wizarding world, respected, influential, and widely regarded as one of the most brilliant minds of his generation. The Fantastic Beasts films do an okay job of picking up the slack from 1926 onward, so I won't explain what happens next. All you need to know is that Dumbledore eventually duels Grindelwald in 1945 and ends up imprisoning him, but you already knew that. However, I do find it interesting that, despite the focus of those films being Dumbledore and Grindelwald, they still managed to avoid a lot of the specific circumstances surrounding Dumbledore's backstory. And interestingly, the films don't just omit portions of his life, but also his death, as his funeral is also completely omitted from the films. In the books, Dumbledore's funeral is a somber and emotional affair that I'd argue is one of the most important moments in the entire series. Classes are cancelled, exams are postponed, hundreds of golden chairs are arranged in neat rows, facing a marble table at the front, and witches and wizards from across the wizarding world travel to Hogwarts to pay their respects to what many openly call the greatest headmaster Hogwarts has ever known. An extraordinary assortment of people had already settled into half of the chairs, shabby and smart, old and young. Most Harry did not recognize, but there were a few that he did, including members of the Order of the Phoenix. Kingsley Shacklebolt, Mad-Eye Moody, Tonks, her hair miraculously returned to vividest pink, Remus Lupin, with whom she seemed to be holding hands, Mr. and Mrs. Weasley, Bill, supported by Fleur, and followed by Fred and George, who were wearing jackets of black dragon skin. The funeral provides a moment of collective pause. For the characters, it provides closure, and for readers, it reinforces the scale of what the wizarding world has lost. And as the ceremony concludes, Dumbledore's body is laid to rest in a way unlike any other character in the series. Bright white lights had erupted next to Dumbledore's body and the table upon which it lay. Higher and higher they rose, obscuring the body. White smoke spiraled in the air and made strange shapes. Harry thought for one heart-stopping moment that he saw a phoenix fly joyfully in the blue, but in a second the fire had vanished. In its place lay a marble white tomb, encasing Dumbledore's body and the table on which he had now rested. The official reason cited for the omission of Dumbledore's funeral was the film's budget, being deemed just too expensive to film. But personally, I find that explanation difficult to accept. Dumbledore's funeral provides a moment of closure for a character that we got to know over nearly a decade, and if you consider the commercial success of the books and films, citing financial reasons just doesn't really make much sense to me. Either way, hopefully this video helped you get to know old Albus Dumbledore a little bit better. Let me know in the comment section below who you want me to cover next. If you enjoy the content, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Until next time, remember, it does not do to dwell on dreams and to forget to live.